Hi everyone, my name is Tim Mobbs. I'm Head of Networks at Teach First, and I've got the absolute pleasure today of interviewing Kiran Gill, 2010 Ambassador. So Kiran, I'll throw it over to you to introduce yourself a bit wider than that.
Yeah, okay. Hi, so I'm Kiran. I'm a 2010 ambassador and I lead a charity called The Difference.
Amazing.
Um, yeah, is that enough?
Yeah, no, that's great. And then I think it dives straight in. So like The Difference, amazing charity doing amazing things. That's kind of the current chapter. So I want to take us right back to the beginning when you applied for Teach First. Could you give us an overview of like what drove you to apply for Teach First and how you've got to where you are now?
Yeah, it feels like a big story. But I'll give you the shortened version. So I have always been a school policies nerd, which is a very weird thing to be a nerd about. Um, but my mum and dad were both teachers, and I swore I wasn't going to be a teacher. Then I went to university and got so interested in education. I ended up writing my dissertation on the differences between a policy design in practice and its implementation in the local authority that I lived in. And I got so into it. I felt like this was maybe what I wanted to do with my life, my job. Like I wanted to work at the Department for Education. But my supervisor at university was working at the Department of Education and she'd never been a teacher. And I was like, what? That seems pretty weird. You're setting out edicts about what should happen, but you've not been on the ground actually doing the work with the young people, with, the community. So I didn't want that to be me. And I heard about Teach First, and having thought in my mind, oh, I don't want to be a teacher forever because of my parents. I thought this would be perfect because I do want to be a teacher and like serve my local community for a while. And then I'll just, see how it goes. And I was expecting to sort of temper my like student idealism with some real world experience, but I wasn't expecting to absolutely love teaching, to come to work dressed as stuffed olive, and to meet some of the best people I have met in my life who've totally shaped everything that's happened since, personally and professionally.
Amazing. Stuffed olive. I want to unpick that a little bit more. Is that just a daily thing or is that for a
Yeah,
specific reason?
I just decided, the work wardrobe isn't good enough. No,
That was the
uh,
personal brand.
that was personal brand stuffed olive. No, when I was teaching, I led on literacy, and reading was just my jam, and still is. I'm in a children's bedroom. I'm now trying to do that. This is my niece's bedroom, and we do lots of reading here. But yeah, I set up World Book Day while I was there. And I tried, basically my teacher persona and my leader persona is to try and give people permission to be who they are by being as ridiculous as possible.
Nice.
So I thought dressing as a stuffed olive would sort of hit that.
Love it.
Hit that. Yeah.
So taught for a while and then decision point. Like what was the decision point? Like I think we've heard you wanted to be policy. So was that the next step?
No, I actually thought that I would be a teacher forever. I just bloody loved it. I had such a great time. But I had this real sort of cognitive dissonance, because I happened to be a secondary school teacher whilst my sisters were going through secondary school. And funnily enough, I was training at Teach First with colleagues who were teaching them and in their schools. And so that was a really interesting point of sort of contrast, really. I was so lucky to be in a school. It was a privilege that was on a real journey, going from special measures to outstanding and having really big impact on young people's lives and a lot of value added for the most deprived students. But even still, there were really vulnerable young people who I felt like we didn't quite know, or we weren't quite doing what they needed. And I saw those young people in my home after school every day because my sister's friends came around the table. And some people know I've got an unusual family. My sisters are my sisters via adoption, and they had quite difficult early life experiences, which I definitely saw playing out in school, including really struggling to essentially, use their prefrontal cortex when they were full of cortisol and stress, the neuroscience for you there. And they were often triggered to have a lot of cortisol in their bodies because of some of the threat experiences that happened in those early years. So they were always in the bottom sets, right? Because exams just really weren't the place where they could use that prefrontal cortex that triggered so much shame and fear. They were always in the bottom sets, and the young people that they were friends with were the most vulnerable. And I grew up in Hackney, and we've also got a lot of challenges in some of our, in our local community around safety. And so I had these experiences around the kitchen table after work and in the summer holidays of seeing some young people like the young people I was teaching and knowing what was happening for them outside of school. And also what happened to them after school, because I think we can be quite institutionalized, right? I mean, we do want to drive up young people's literacy rates, their numeracy, their ability to access professions, but particularly at school, we often talk about university. And then it was a really sobering reality to live the rest of my life with some of those young people who've had some really quite difficult trajectories outside of school, including exclusion, criminal exploitation, and some other really, really difficult things that I think if I'd just been a teacher and trying to drive up literacy in my school and improve our GCSE outcomes, I might not necessarily in those first few years have had that experience. So that's what drove me actually to leave school teaching. I just felt like some of the policy changes that were happening in my school just weren't allowing us to put our effort where we most wanted to put it and where we thought it would really make the difference. Like, I came to teach first, it's pretty corny, basically because I believed in the mission. And I think that we need to address educational inequality, and that it's not fair that young people with more disadvantaged backgrounds don't get what they need. And I felt like the policy context was sort of sometimes exacerbating that for us as teachers and the school leaders that I worked with. It wasn't giving us that permission to focus on the things that we needed to focus on most. And it also sometimes was just incentivizing a professional development context that gave me so much if I wanted to work out how to improve the Ofsted score of my department, or if I wanted to think more about subject knowledge. But if the barriers to the support and thriving of the young people in front of me actually weren't necessarily those things as much as they were mental health barriers or safeguarding barriers, there just wasn't the professional development for me necessarily, and certainly not the evidence-led strategic leadership professional development that would help me make that difference for those young people. And that's what drove me to set up the school leadership charity, The Difference. So
we've said The Difference a few times there, so it feels natural to go on. So for people that don't know about The Difference, like, could you explain a little bit about what it is that you're doing? Because it is fantastic, so it'd be great to kind of dig into that a bit.
So I left the classroom wanting to go into policy and understand, how do these big decisions get made? Who's doing this, and what research has gone into it? And it was really interesting. I ended up doing a lot of educational research. I went to work for Alan Milburn and Gillian Shepherd at the Social Mobility Commission. Then I worked at the think tank IPPR. And then I was invited to become an advisor to Edward Timpson when he led his independent review into school exclusion. And I did do some amazing research where I got to visit schools up and down the country doing incredible things with their communities and their young people. But I also felt like, wow, there's research, but there's also just people who get stuff done. Like, the answer to the question, how does policy change, is people make choices and they push stuff through. And I found that really interesting. And I was happened to have worked at Teach First for a bit alongside somebody I'd not met before, a guy called Emmanuel Akpaninwang, who's basically one of my idols. And he was setting up a charity. And I was like, wow, that is pretty wild. That's amazing. I can't believe he's just setting up a charity. And as I was talking to him, it became really clear. I tried to pull his idea into different directions. And then I was like, you know what? I think that's a charity I'd like to drive and run. And he didn't want to do any of those ideas. So that's how I came up to sort of the idea of setting up The Difference. Who are The Difference? What do we do? Essentially, The Difference exists to sort of disrupt the patterns around young people, particularly vulnerable people, missing learning through absence and exclusion. And The Difference does this by supporting the expertise of school leaders and trying to change incentives around those leaders. To date, our sector-leading programmes have supported hundreds of schools in raising teacher confidence, in de-escalating challenging behaviour, but also measurably improving whole school inclusion. And we've also been privileged to work with the Department for Education, with some big multi-academy trusts and local authorities, thinking about and Ofsted, thinking about their system-wide incentives around whole school inclusion.
Amazing.
And if I was going to summarize it also, I'd say, all of that rigor. So in the last 10 years, we've seen a lot of developments in professional development, especially around evidence-led practice that supports us to do, say, to deliver our subjects. But I think there's been much less research and much less evidence-based practice in the really important parts of schools, the foundational parts of schools, which support young people's learning. So when I'm saying that, I'm thinking safeguarding, mental health, access across different types of neurodiversity and special educational needs. And the evidence base there and the support for strategic leadership of that work hasn't necessarily existed in the same way. And at the difference, I guess I saw 3 key areas where we could make a difference. Number one, people. I think Teach First is incredible because it builds a whole community, a cohort of people who are driving in the same direction, saying this issue is a challenge, it's really important, and I'm going to make my individual contribution. But then we can network and draw on other people's contributions. At the difference, I wanted to create just that sort of pioneering, innovative cohort of leaders, not just thinking about socioeconomic inequality, but actually thinking about the most vulnerable learners who are increasingly losing learning through absence, through exclusions. How do we reduce that? And how do we boost their access so they get the learning they deserve? So people. The second is practice. As I said, there's been loads of research on the evidence-based practice and teaching and learning, and a lot of that has informed what good professional development looks like in the last few years. But there just hasn't been the same evidence base of what works for young people experiencing crisis, or for our communities experiencing crisis, where we've got endemic mental ill health challenges, potentially in the community, safeguarding challenges. So the second P, we had people. I'm an English teacher, can you tell? We have people, practice. So the difference exists to try and gather some of the most innovative but effective practice in measurably changing inclusion and improving it in a school. And then policy, trying to work with policymakers to understand what helps and what hinders school leaders in doing that amazing work, and to shift policy expectations so that that work can thrive.
Amazing. Now I'm going to ask quite a selfish question as head of networks of Teach First. And you mentioned the network and the community, and I'd be really fascinated to hear, because obviously we spoke before and like you talked about how the network had supported like in the conceptualization and like building the difference. And if there's ambassadors out there who are similar there, so they see someone like you saw Emmanuel, it's like, oh, start a charity, I quite fancy doing that. Like, I guess there's 2 points to this question. Like, A, how do you make that step? Like, how do you do that? I mean, I know that's going to be quite an in-depth answer. Maybe people need to come and watch your session at the gathering to hear more about that one. And then the second one is like, how do you tap into that network that you mentioned, and like, how do you make the most of those connections?
I've been thinking a bit about what's been the legacy of my time in the classroom. And I think teaching is the best training for absolutely any job. Like, I wouldn't have thought it. And definitely when I left teaching, I thought, how can I do this next thing? There's so much to learn. And when I started my own organization, I thought, oh my goodness, how do I do this? But I think teaching teaches you. You've got to dive in, especially on the Teach First program, but you've got to be humble. You've got to test, and then you've got to learn quickly from the feedback. It teaches you, so long as you're setting out with your outcomes in mind, that's the most important thing. And that actually you need to beg, borrow and steal. Everything can look scary and intimidating, and nothing's worth doing, I think, if it isn't, if it doesn't have that element of difficulty because somebody hasn't done it before and it needs doing now. But nothing that needs doing hasn't actually been done in a different way by somebody else out there. And I think when I was learning to teach, I had to go and see other teachers and invite people in and ask them for feedback and look online and read about stuff that I found really interesting. And I think that's the same in any walk of life. And it certainly was the same when I was trying to set up a charity, is actually look out there, go out there. I just tried to interview as many people as possible, ask people advice. And what I was really surprised by was that they wanted to give it. I think sometimes it can feel really intimidating, and lots of the people that I have been huge in my life are people where it's happenstance, like we were placed in the same school during Teach First, and then like we fell in love and had a family, or they're my best friend and we've lived together for years, or whatever it is. I worked alongside them when I was at Teach First, and you know, they're one of my best friends. But lots of people in the Teach First community who have become huge in my life, professionally and sometimes personally, I didn't know them at all. But I knew that we had this connection. We believed in the same thing. We both did Teach First. And I also knew that because of that, they were only one step removed from me. So maybe somebody I knew them, or maybe I could see them online on Twitter, or maybe I could bump into them at a conference. And if I went in my bright blazer and sat at the front and asked a question with my hand up, then afterwards I could come back stage and can I talk to them and say, hey, I'm trying to do this thing. Could I take you for coffee and ask your advice for an hour? And amazingly, everyone said yes, and they were then huge influences in what went on to happen. So I managed to catch Josh McAllister in just that sort of way. I knew someone who knew him, and I tried to get a phone call with him loads of different times. It was very difficult, but I persisted because I knew that he was interested. And actually, when he gave me the time, it was incredible. And he became the founding trustee of The Difference. Those that don't know, Josh McAllister, incredible man, founder, CEO of Frontline for Children's Social Work, taking some elements of the Teach First model into children's social work. And most recently just did the independent review into children's social work, writing some really bold policy recommendations on how to make things better for those young people. So yeah, Josh McAllister, I chased him down, and then he wanted to become a trustee of The Difference, founded it with me in being a trustee. Some colleagues like Jamie from Jamie's Farm. I was on Jamie's farm with some young people and got chatting to him in the farm, in the tractor, actually, with some sheep in the back. And then a couple of years later, I thought, he's amazing. I'd love his advice. I'm going to seek him out. And even though I hadn't spoken to him for 2 years, and maybe he didn't remember that conversation in the tractor, he did. And he said yes, or he pretended he did. And then he became an advisor on the IPPR report and gave me such good advice as I was doing that research into exclusions across the country. Or Ed Van Care, also a massive hero head teacher. And I happened to be at a roundtable with him at the Department for Education. But similarly, I could have sought him out on Twitter or through a friend of a friend, and I just asked the question. I allowed myself to be vulnerable, just like when I was teaching, just like when I said, it isn't working in this classroom, I really want you to come and watch me, or can I come and see that young person with you, or will you brainstorm some strategies with me? I said, Ed, I'm trying to do this thing, it's a bit scary and I don't know if it works, will you chuck some ideas around with me? And that was really formative in developing The Difference's first program models. Laura McInerney, similarly, absolute hero, watched her from afar, so interested. And then one day we happened to work together. She asked me if I'd like to write a column. So Teach First is, I think, giving each other legs up all over the place. And Natasha Porter, I'm going to be on the panel with her. What a woman. She not only has been amazing, I actually talked with her briefly, but from that part of my career, and setting up The Difference, but also as I've come back as a mum CEO for the first time, had my baby, I was interviewing Natasha, like, how do you do this job with a baby? What does it look like? Everywhere you look, I think they don't need to be people already in your network. This is about trying to address educational inequality through education. And I think everybody who's gone through those 2 years knows what the stakes are and how important it is. And it doesn't matter what they're doing now. I think ambassadors out there, if you're thinking about tapping people up, just be brave and do it, because that's what the community's for. And you'll be surprised how often people say yes, and how much richer your life and your work is going to be because of it.
I think that's perfect. That last bit for me is because I found when I finished the 2 years, small town on the edge of Bradford, like, had all this community talk through those 2 years, and then it was like, where's the community gone? And it was only when I started actively engaging it that actually there was all that rich connection. But it was only when I had that realization that I actually actively need to do this, and, like you say, be vulnerable and make the effort to do the networking, that suddenly there was all these opportunities and connections that I hadn't found because I was waiting for it to come to me. So, like, that's the best advice I've heard. I think is be vulnerable, go for it, and just ask, because there's so many people that want to say yes, and like,
there's so much. Yeah, and that's it, isn't it? It's professional development. And if that was your take in the classroom, Tim, if you'd just been like, oh, I want it to come to me, I want to become an outstanding teacher, but it's day one and I'm, I don't know anything. Well, it wouldn't happen, would it? And it's the same with your career. And the ambitions you've got for young people, like if you reach out and find people, or reach in to Teach First and ask for those networks, so much of what happened to me happened because I did some different Teach First internships. I did one at the Department for Education. I did one at the think tank IPPR. I did one at CFBT. It's now the Education Development Trust. And those gave me such an interesting insight into different types of work. And again, different networks to build relationships in. There's just so much if you lean in, but you've got to lean in.
Yeah, got to lean in. I think that's the main thing. So 2 questions. This is all amazing stuff. So the first one, is there an example or a couple of examples of where, I mean, you'll have loads, but where you've really come away from a day or a project and had a real impact here?
So I'll give you an example. One leader that we have worked with at The Difference, a chap called Tom. And when we came to work with him, he'd recently been working in a more rural community, having previously worked in the city. And the school that he was joining was a wonderful community, but really struggling with attendance. And actually also with high levels of young people losing learning, not just through not attending, but through fixed term exclusions. And Tom really took on that challenge, and with The Difference, we supported him over a year to really drive up attendance, actually recently been the highest recorded in the school's history. And through supporting all staff in their confidence in working with young people, including through crisis and challenging behaviours, Tom was able to really change that story and see an 80% reduction in those exclusions. And now he's a principal. And that's an example of, where I feel incredibly proud. I managed to headhunt some people who are much smarter than me and had done exactly what The Difference believes needs to happen in practice, which is intentional strategic leadership from the top to drive whole school inclusion, picking up on the best elements of whole school professional development research and practice. That means real clarity of leadership. That means every staff member part of the training, and using neuroscience. I talked a little bit earlier about how stress hormone cortisol at times of threat can make your prefrontal cortex, where you do longer term thinking, decision making, accessing your longer term memory, inaccessible to you, because as an animal, that's how our brain physiology and our neurobiology works. Using that science to think about how we can craft safer environments for young people where they are able to access this part of their brain and build trusting long-term relationships with adults so that they can learn and so that they can stay in learning and not fall out of learning. And so through work like that with Tom over the last 5 years, we've been able to understand some really pivotal elements of practice, like the exclusions continuum, which takes all sorts of missing learning, right from missing your break time or standing outside the classroom door, way up to getting managed, moved into a different school, or sadly having to be permanently excluded. And says none of these things are bad in and of themselves. They are all tools that leaders use at different times. But actually, if we get curious, we discover that at almost every point where we've got good data, it's the most vulnerable learners who are overrepresented in that missing learning. It's young people living in poverty with probably a time of mental health crisis, maybe recognised mental health problems, sometimes special educational needs, and very often, overwhelmingly, interacting with social services because things in their life are not safe at the moment. So we support those leaders to use a tool like this continuum to look at patterns in the data in their school and try and disrupt those patterns, and to also look upstream and try and use that to intervene and use some really exciting practices that can rebuild relationships at times of rupture and help connect a child to school so they can come through that crisis and keep learning and thrive. So that's an example. That's an example of where I feel.
What an example! What an example! What impact in the system? So if there's leaders listening to this that want to find out more about The Difference, like what should they do? And we're going to link it in the tweet and things like that. But like, if they want to get in touch, is it a website?
Yeah, absolutely. So if leaders want to find out about The Difference, just a reminder, we work with school leaders. So that's assistants, deputies, and a lot of head teachers. And we've also been doing some system work with multi-academy trusts, looking at how they disrupt and improve the patterns in who doesn't attend and who gets excluded from learning. So that's www.the-difference.com, www.the-difference.com. Or you can follow us at The Difference Ed on Twitter, or you can contact me, that's Kiran on Twitter, Kiran Gill, or my programs director, Sean Brown. So check us out.
Great. And final question. So it's 20 years since the first cohort of Teach First teachers went into schools, which blows my mind. So you've obviously been involved for over half of these 20 years. Same with me. So what does 20 years of Teach First mean to you?
I think it's hard to summarize it. For me, it's hugely emotional. It's incredible to think that I did the program more than a decade ago, and yet it's still a massive part of my identity. And there's been times when it hasn't been, but as I said, since I leaned in after finishing teaching into our community and used that to help me do the change I wanted to make for young people and the most vulnerable in society, it's still become a really core part of my identity. And I you can cut this bit out, but I wrote to Brett when he stepped down, and I said, I have met all the most important people in my life through Teach First. You know, I've ended up having a child, all of the people who stood by me in the hardest times of my life, when my mum died, all the funnest part of my life. All of those people I met through Teach First, and who picked me up when things have been really hard in my career, some of the most difficult times, who inspire me and keep me committed into my work and just give me the most incredible professional development. And 20 years of that journey means for me that there's like layer upon layer and layer of those people out there in our country, doing that work in schools, but also in multi-academy trusts, in the Department for Education, in charities, in business. And it just means that there's a massive network where it's like, it's really happening. It's happening, I guess, as it was intended to happen. Brilliant people on the ground, connected to brilliant people all over the place, who all believe that this story needs to change and actually are part of making it change. So yeah, what does it mean to me? Something kind of personal and emotional, but also something inspiring about what I think our working lives should be for.
Thank you so much, Kiran, for sharing. So Kiran's going to be speaking on the 1st of July on the, let me get this right, the Business Enterprise Charity and the Broader Community tent, in the first session, which is Looking Back, Ambassadors Making a Difference from Beyond the Classroom. It's an amazing panel. Kiran's part of that. So do come see Kiran on that, I was going to say show, on that panel. It will be a show. It's an amazing array of experience with amazing people doing amazing things. And if people are there on the day, Kiran, like, I want to come and speak to you, what's your advice to them?
My advice is wear something bright, but that's always my advice because I'm an extrovert, so people can see you. Stick your hand up first and ask a question, because people are too nervous at the beginning to answer questions. So if you try, you probably will get picked on, and then use that to come and chat to people on the panel. I'd say, network. Somebody recently, actually, Lem Sisse, the poet, recently told me he doesn't use the word networking because it's like really cringe, but he builds friendships, he builds relationships. And I was like, yeah, I love that. That sits with me. That's what happens to me. The people that I asked for advice for all those years ago, you know, I still see regularly, and they lift me up in all my hardest moments, and they inspire me in my best moments too. Build some relationships, meet some people, and don't pre-decide who they're going to be. Go and find people that you connect with, and don't rule yourself out, rule yourself in. Go and speak to all of the people that you really want to speak to.
Love that. Rule yourself in. I think that's a perfect place to end. Kiran, thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Tim. It's been loads of fun.